Welcome to today's episode of the Battle for African Agriculture. In this series, we explore the struggles, the stories, and the strategies shaping food and farming on our continent and beyond. Today, we are joined by Pat Mooney, pioneering voice in the global fight for seed sovereignty, biodiversity, and food justice. Pat is a co-founder of the ETC Group, an organization that has spent decades exposing dangers of corporate control over food, agriculture, and technology. For over 40 years, he has been a leading voice warning about seed patents, intellectual property rights, and the monopolization of agriculture. He has worked alongside farmers, indigenous peoples, and activists across the world, amplifying their resistance and advocating for policies that protect biodiversity and farmers manage the system. I'm very, very much honored, Pat, having you. You are my hero, and I was fortunate enough to sit with you as part of the IPES Food, International Panel of Experts on the Sustainability of Food. And your contribution to the panel and to our struggle is immense. And we have a hell lot of respect here in Africa for you. Welcome to my podcast, Pat.
Well, thank you, and that's very kind of you.
Thank you. Pat, could you start by sharing your personal journey? What led you into the world of biodiversity, seeds, and technology politics?
Well, yes, I can. I'll be very brief, I think. It actually goes back 60 years. I was in high school when I first was shocked by some of the news I was hearing about the problems of hunger in the world, and thought the solutions were quite easy. I just had to, excuse me, I just had to raise more money, try to help raise more money. And it was all a matter of development assistance, and we could solve the problems. I got disabused of that pretty quickly. And when I left high school, I immediately got involved in international activities by one fluke and another. Was overseas, and was my first meetings, I think, at FAO, UN Food and Agriculture Organization, were in January of 1966. And
19?
66.
66, okay.
Yeah.
What happened in 1966?
I was invited to Rome, and because in those days, it was the 60s. So if you were a high school dropout and you had long hair and torn blue jeans, you got invited to the United Nations. And the director, and the director general there, I was introduced to him somehow, and that's kind of unusual in that sense. And he asked me if I'd be a youth consultant to him, and just on a voluntary basis. I never worked for FAO. And that got me tangled up in one thing and another, in the World Food Congress in The Hague in 1970, in the World Food Conference, political conference on food in 1974 with Henry Kissinger and all kinds of exciting people. And then the major conference that we had in UNCTAD in Nairobi in 1976. But we started this, what was called RAFI in those days in 1977. But my real origins, I guess, around seeds, and recognizing that was going to turn out to be a large part of my life, began in Kandy in Sri Lanka, when I was trying to find out why was there so much starvation on tea estates in Sri Lanka just after the government had nationalized the tea estates, and finding from farmers who were smuggling me into the tea estates at night through their rice fields.
Why is they smuggling you? Was
Because
not
the government,
allowed?
they wouldn't let us in. And I was trying to interview the farmers, and some trade union people, Tamil trade union workers, were trying to help me to get into the estates, to get out stories about what was happening. And but just getting into the tea estates, one farmer, one time, I asked him how his rice crop was, and I knew nothing about rice, absolutely nothing. Didn't even like it, frankly. And I was a potato person, an Irish potato person. And he said that his crop wasn't good. And I said, what was wrong? And he said, well, the seeds they give us are terrible. And I said, well, can't you use other seeds? He said, no, they're gone. And And that was news to me, that there was a loss of seed. There could be genetic erosion of any kind in agriculture.
Mm.
And but I just put it in the back of my head and went about my business. But a few months later, I was organizing the first really large civil society effort to lobby in a United Nations structure in a serious way to try to change policy. And that was
Mhm.
the UNCTAD conference, which is mainly on agricultural commodities.
UNCTAD is what?
The United Nations conference, well, then it was the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. They've upstaged
Mhm.
their name a little bit since then, but it's the same
Mhm.
organization. And the Nairobi meeting in 1976 was at the height of the new international economic order and all that kind of very encouraging moment in a sense. And
Mhm.
we had over 100 people we brought together from about 23 countries to civil society members to lobby
Mhm.
for fair prices for commodities in Nairobi. But what I
Mhm.
really recall was a meeting with the National Christian Council of Kenya, and they had an agricultural expert there, a Kenyan, who, when I was mentioned something about this rice farmer in Sri Lanka, said, "Well, don't you know that all the wheat you grow in Canada comes from Kenya?" And I was
Mm.
and that just made no sense to me. What? I grew up in the Canadian prairies. We have winters, not like anything in Kenya.
Mm.
Totally different environment. And we said, yes, there's a variety of ours. It's all your wheat in Canada. And
Mm.
it was stuck in the back of my head when I finally got home. I've been traveling for about 14 months. I got back to Canada, went to the local library in Saskatchewan in Canada, the middle of the wheat growing territory at that time.
Mm.
And the library identified a variety called Kenyan Farmer that was bred into the wheat variety, which was about 2/3 of the wheat crop of Canada. And
Wow.
and I found that not only was it Kenyan farmer, but that was the major input into the Canadian wheat. But
Mm.
there were varieties from 13 other countries, almost all of which were from the global south. And so that
Mm.
Canada, which saw itself as the breadbasket of the world, was actually kind of the genetic basket case of the rest of the world. We
Mm.
received the genes for all of our crops, not just wheat, but everything else in Canada pretty much that we were growing commercially, all came
Mm.
from the global south. And that
Mm.
would
Incredible.
to me, that was
Mm.
educationally interesting. I can only say
Mhm.
that. It was not that I thought that it was a political issue or a social issue in some way.
Mhm.
It was simply
Mhm.
fascinating that my part of the world that saw itself as the beneficiary of the global south was
Mhm.
actually receiving from the global south.
Mhm.
And then looking into it a little bit further, it didn't take much. I read
Mhm.
a speech by our Minister of Agriculture in Canada who said that he was going to introduce plant breeders' rights legislation, a form of plant
Mhm.
patenting. And he was going to
Mhm.
do that for two reasons: to make a more beautiful Canada and
Mhm.
to feed the world. And I and I thought to myself, even at that age, yes, you should laugh. That it made no
Yeah.
sense. That
Yeah.
Canada doesn't
Incredible.
introduce patent legislation to make
To
something
feed
more
the world.
beautiful, and it doesn't do it to feed the world. So I started to investigate it and
Mm.
realized it was complete nonsense, of course,
Mm.
and then learned pretty quickly that not only were these plant patents or a form of patenting being introduced not only in Canada but in several other countries, and this is 1977 now I'm talking about,
Mm.
but also that the the um, the there was a move by major companies to buy out all the
Mm.
small family seed companies. And
Mm.
so those major companies were like oil companies and pharmaceutical companies and chemical companies. And when you put the three things together, uh,
Mm.
control through intellectual property,
Mhm.
and as I discovered it, the huge, massive genetic erosion of food crops around the world because of the Green Revolution and because of patents, as I interpreted it,
Mm.
and add to that the talk about, even in those days, the possibility of new
Mm.
technologies coming down the road, that the world was, and the takeover of small seed companies by these huge companies, then that was a cause for alarm, and we started to organize what we called RAFI. And by the end of 1977, we,
Mm-hmm.
we created the Rural Advancement Foundation International
Mm-hmm.
out of a meeting in Saskatchewan in Canada. And it was by, I should say, it was by no means just me. It was my colleague Carrie Fowler, who was an American. Um, it was also Hope Shand, who has worked with me for long and hard and still works on these issues. Who's also in the United States, and Bev Cross, who was working with me as a high school student at that time, who turned
Mm-hmm.
out to be a computer genius and solved most of our data control problems in those days.
Hmm. Um, can I take you back to 1974, you know? That's when the word food security was coined. Am I wrong? And
Absolutely.
also Henry Kissinger wrote. Can you tell us about the politics of that time and why that year is significant?
Well, we knew it to be significant more afterward. The time we thought it was significant really because it was the first political meeting on food. Everyone said this is all in the
Mm-hmm.
past. It's been about how do we feed the hungry as rich people in the North. This was a conference on the political negotiations between the idea of a new international economic order
Mm-hmm.
versus the northern approach of controlling the world, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a political battle. And and so we went to that conference as Canadians. We went to that especially because we were alarmed by the dangers of it all, and we had managed to get sort of a small coalition of groups together from different countries. We were all, I must say, from the industrialized North. Those
Mm-hmm.
of us who were there, I think, with rare exceptions, were from the North. If they were from the South, they were perhaps attending university or briefly involved in the South in Europe for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, one of the many things we didn't even recognize to be an issue at the time. Before this is over, I will have to give you a long list of the things we should have known and did not know in those days, which I've
Mm-hmm.
learned painfully over the decades. It's a long, embarrassing list, but it should be known by everybody else. Anyway, we uh, the battle turned out to be more important still because it was the end of the breakup of the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, as the one body in the global system, in the UN system, that was
Mm-hmm.
responsible for all the aspects of food and agriculture. You know,
Mm-hmm.
from 1945 until that time, um, the FAO really had all of the tools, all the instruments it was supposed to be using to solve the problems of food and agriculture. It had a scientific part, which it
Mm-hmm.
lost in 1971 already, though
Mm-hmm.
it didn't fully understand how much the loss was, and it lost that to the creation of the consultative group on international agricultural research, the Green Revolution folks,
KCJ, yeah.
which is taken away from them by the World Bank in the United States, Rockefeller and Ford
Mm-hmm.
foundations. And it also was losing already, but hadn't lost what it had created, which was the World Food Program, which was the
Mm-hmm.
emergency aid part of FAO. And that was
Mm-hmm.
hived away from it as well and became a separate institution altogether. And the function of agriculture in development in terms of funding, the financial role of that, which was also with FAO in 1974, was taken away from FAO and put into the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So
Mm-hmm.
FAO was left strictly as a body that dealt with normative issues, regulatory issues, issues around treaties and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, sort of data collection work. But all of the major tools for change, or almost all the major tools for change, were taken away from it at that moment. And
Okay.
and that was a critical. We we saw that the placebo that was given to the global south and to those of us in civil society that were kind of catching on to what was happening was that don't worry, there's going to be a committee on world food security, which is going
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that everything can stay together. And with that, we even have a council of agricultural ministers.
Mm-hmm.
And that committee on world food security will be a UN level committee, not just an FAO committee, so it'll be above FAO. and it would have regular annual meetings that would solve the issues. I went to the first meeting of that committee, by the way, in 1974, the first sort of
Mhm.
inaugural discussion. It almost turned into a fist fight. It was
Oh,
quite
wow.
astonishing. It was amazing. I
Between between whom and whom?
South and North, uh,
Oh.
Africa and
Mm,
Latin Americans, very strongly Latin Americans. Mexico was one of the major movers on that. Uh, the oil states, which were part of the OPEC group and so on, were also
mm,
angry, and they really saw that they've been given the structure which really had on paper a mandate to
mm,
do things and absolutely no resources to do anything, and
mm,
no
mm,
clear guidelines between the various agencies that were being created. So FAO
mm,
was torn apart in 1974, and it took us some time to recognize that that really is what had happened to us. And it
mm,
was tragic because the um, we left. I never went back to a CFS meeting until the mid 2000s, until 2008 or so. I never
mm,
bothered to go to it. It was a waste of time. It was
mm,
an organization that should have been killed. And
mm,
I had friends in the UN Secretariat and in the FAO Secretariat said, "You're overlooking some of the possibilities of this organization. It has some potential, but people are ignoring what could be done with it." And I just thought, no, I'm too busy, not interested. Lots of other stuff to be done,
mm,
and that was another major mistake. But it was
mm,
for that it was a big meeting. I mean, we did see after that really that was the start of the new international economic order and control over national sovereignty over resources,
mm, mm,
which by 1979 or so was completely dead, really.
mm,
The Nairobi meeting, the UNCTAD meeting in Nairobi, I mentioned in '76, was a kind of a last hurrah.
mm. Um, After Rafi, you've started ETC.
Not till the early
Ca- ca-
2000s, though. We had a long history before that of fighting on the seeds
Okay.
issue,
Okay.
several
Well, yeah.
decades.
Please take us back a little bit and
Well,
yeah.
I don't want to bury you in history.
No,
Uh,
it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. Yeah.
well, it was pretty exciting times because in the early days,
Mm,
one thing I should really say is that we put together the fact that the reason why big multinational companies, chemical, pharmaceutical,
mm,
oil companies, were interested in seeds and taking over uh, small family seed companies, pardon me, was because they saw on the horizon the potential to establish patent rights over seeds, which
mm,
was what familiar territory for them. They had that for chemicals. They were getting that already for pharmaceuticals. They hadn't had it until then, around that time, but they got it for
mm,
pharmaceuticals. And they saw, well, this is a great tool for us. We get monopoly control over things. And
mm,
so we see this is a safe territory for us to move into. That was one appeal to them.
mhm,
The second one was, of course, is that they had in the idea that the technologies that were being developed, because it was the very early beginnings of biotechnology and the
mhm,
beginning of cell culture technologies and the possibilities for moving genes around was being talked about. It wasn't in reality, but it was being talked about. And companies thought somehow they will find a way, even if it's just through market advertising, to put together the concerns, pesticides and herbicides with seeds.
mhm,
They could market those two things together. So, and what the Green Revolution had done more than anything else was to show the companies that, unlike what history had taught them, it was really possible to take one plant variety of corn or maize,
mhm,
or rice or wheat and spread it around the world with one trait, the control of semi-dwarf uh, seeds, made that possible. And so
mhm,
that tool of technology, even without biotechnology, together with the possibility of monopoly control over the seeds and that global market, really made it an open territory to be taken over by the companies, the big companies. And we wrote that up. And I remember after our first international meeting in 1977, I think it was in 1980, I first wrote in a little new civil society newsletter we had with others, that companies were going to develop plant varieties that were tolerant of their herbicides
Mhm.
or somehow needed their herbicides. And it was amazing the attacks, which just drove everybody
Mhm.
crazy. The companies were enraged, governments were enraged, scientific organizations were enraged. There were major
Mhm.
studies done by scientific institutions explicitly saying why I was crazy. Science magazine had a letter to
Mhm.
the editor signed by more than 50 scientists around the world saying what I was saying was nonsense. I was hauled up before what was called Ciba-Geigy in those days, which is now the Chinese company Syngenta, um, saying that they invited me to come and meet with their staff. And I remember in the meeting, they said a couple of days sessions, they said to me, well, don't you realize that only about 25% of our research is on herbicide tolerance? And I was flabbergasted. 25% of your research, that's a lot, you know. So you're telling, why are you doing that unless you think it's true, unless you think it's going to happen,
Mhm. Mhm.
which
Mhm.
embarrassed them. So we were sure we were right, and we kept on that, and of course that's been proven right. But the those were difficult times. I remember going to organizations and trying to get them to understand that seeds were important. And one of my first
Yeah.
meetings was with and this is no discredit to the leadership now, but at the time it was the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements, IFOAM.
From
And yeah, and I went to meet their executive in Montreal at that time and said, I'm really concerned about how you're not going to be able to be organic farmers if you can't get the seed you want,
Mm.
and the companies are going to develop something entirely different. And again, it was, what are you talking about? If you get access to seeds, it's no problem at all. Uh, Leave us alone. We
Mm.
have other things
Mm.
to do. And it was really total
Yeah.
disinterest by the major institutions.
Mm.
But it wasn't by the National Farmers Union in Canada,
Mm.
who immediately caught on to the issue and saw it was really important and really campaigned with us on it and led the
Mm.
campaign against plant breeders' rights in Canada and finally, really
Mm.
for many decades, stopped it.
Mm.
Um, and it was farmers in other countries. It was farmers in France, farmers in Germany. I was tied into the global north in those days. I couldn't afford to
Mhm.
travel further. We had a very small organization. There were four of us, and
Yeah.
we were developing more friends, but the friends were among small farmers organizations in different countries who did realize that seeds were
So
important.
were you Rafa by that time?
Yes, we create ourselves as Rafi then, and
Mhm.
the and got support from foundations in Canada and more NGOs in Canada and from the foundations in the United States and a bit in Europe as well. But
So how did ETC start then? I mean, what was, I
well, that
think
was
it,
again, we'd already by that time we had managed to get 1983 as RAFI. We were able to create uh, with the help with the support of the global South and the governments, especially
Mhm.
Mexico, but the Latin Americans. We managed to take on FAO in a meeting they held,
Mhm.
their conference, and push through that there had to be an international convention or something on plant genetic resources. And it was
Mhm.
a vicious fight. It's still quite famous inside FAO
Mm.
historically as a fight in which um, the U.S. chair of the conference of FAO had to call 6 votes and finally agree to electronic ballot that was secret before he finally conceded that he hadn't got the vote and he'd lost, and there was going to be an international commission on plant genetic resources at FAO.
So the fight is to create a
Create
commission.
At
Uh,
first, it was to create the commission. We proposed that there should be a commission and there should be a treaty. But
So
the first,
the FAO at that time the leadership didn't want that.
not at all. Well, no, the FAO
Mm.
leadership did, frankly.
Mhm.
But the chair of the FAO conference at that time was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under Ronald Reagan in
Is it a
'83.
separate structure? The chair of FAO and the FAO itself are two separate structures?
Well, he is the chair of the FAO Council and Conference.
Ah, okay, so that's a
and,
separate structure,
and
Council of
it's an
Conference.
elected position, but he's
Aha.
and he's but not the director general. The director general is sort of
Is
God
a kind
inside
of
the
secretariat, yeah.
yeah, the secretariat, whereas the chair was the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States at that
Mm-hmm.
time. And he was absolutely opposed to, and the whole global north was absolutely opposed to the creation of this commission. He kept saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Everything's fine. What's your concern about? You're following these crazy people that are saying there's a problem and there isn't a
Yeah.
problem.
So
Uh,
Commission for the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources.
no,
That's
it
what
was
you wanted to
that,
create.
no, we wanted to
Mm.
create a commission which would then create the treaty. We got the
Uh-huh.
commission first. We didn't get the treaty then,
Yeah,
but
yeah, okay.
we did get kind of a protocol or an international undertaking on plant genetic resources.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
but that was that. They agreed to the commission in '83. They were forced to have it. The commission met for the first time in '85. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the global south, I mean, I must say, especially the Latin Americans first, the Africans second, were very vociferous in as governments in being enraged by the fact that it was clear we were showing clearly how the
Mm-hmm.
global how all the seeds that were being collected and stored in gene banks were really at the service of companies in the north and not of any benefit to anything in the south.
So that was the issue. The
That was the
seeds.
issue. The control had
Okay.
gone to the north, and my colleague Bev Cross managed to
Mm-hmm.
take. This is the early days of computers, and she was able to. We had a computer. It was
Mm-hmm.
outrageous. We had a computer. No one else seemed to have. FAO didn't have computers. We took
Oh,
this.
really?
No, they didn't. And
Wow.
and and there were no computers. And FAO, we got the data book that was produced, which showed all of the plant genetic resources that have been collected internationally from every
Mm-hmm.
country by number and what gene banks they've been stored in.
Mm-hmm.
And but it wasn't clear because it was just numbers. She put it
Mm-hmm.
all onto a spreadsheet and made it, we were able to see which country gave what to who. And it showed a
Mm-hmm.
massive flow of seeds from the south to the north, and especially a
Mm-hmm.
massive flow of seeds from everywhere in the south to the United States and to Germany and to France and to the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And so that enraged the global south. And we were saying if the global north actually paid a royalty on all of which had been donated to them by farmers in the global south, instead of having the global south pay patent royalties for seeds from the north
That is already taken from them, huh?
that are already taken from them, that there'd be
Yeah.
a major profit to the south instead of to the north. The south would make more money out
Crazy,
of it.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that was that battle. That was still into the days of what we called RAFI.
Mm-hmm.
Center Group was just a change of name we made in 2002 because we expanded our horizons to a number of other topics. But
Sorry.
the real
You were a
difference between
bit
RAFI,
fast. Mm.
yeah, the difference between RAFI and the Center Group was only that the same people changed the name because we recognized that from technical reasons in U.S. Uh, um, civil society laws,
Mm.
tax laws, and so on. It was helpful
Mm.
to have our headquarters in Canada, and it was also that our horizons had expanded beyond simply. Well, that's another issue. I can explain a little bit about that, but we had a
Mm.
different understanding of how the world was by then. We realized that the whole what was happening wasn't just a seeds issue; it was a much wider
Mm.
biotechnology, genetic resources of all species sort of issue that required a wider concentration
Mhm.
on our part. So we changed
Mhm.
our name for that reason. But we also in the '80s though still I just very quickly tell you that we started to move towards the seed treaty, but it was a slow and painful process. They didn't want it. In 1985, we did get through this commission in FAO the notion of plant breeders' rights.
Mhm.
Sorry, not, I'm saying the wrong thing. The notion of farmers' rights.
Mhm.
And that was presented as a counter to, hey, if you guys are trying to push on to us plant breeders' rights, then don't forget there is also the concept of farmers' rights, and that was accepted as not as an answer to plant breeders' rights really, but as that farmers' rights were there, they existed to
Mhm.
control and own their own
Mhm.
genetic diversity, and that ended up in the seed treaty. It got marginalized in the seed treaty eventually, which was finally put into
Mhm.
force in 2004. But We also
Mm.
identified biopiracy in the early
Mm-hmm.
1990s and began to show all of the examples of biopiracy where plant
Are you
variety.
the one who coined the word biopiracy?
Yeah, yeah.
Ah, okay.
But
Mm. Yeah,
yeah, I was
good
happy
for
to. I
you.
told a couple of years later, it made the Oxford Dictionary. So it's nice.
Oh, really? Oh, excellent.
I can be.
Congratulations.
Yeah. And anyway, but the issue of biopiracy got spread because we were able to show all kinds of examples of horrendous
Mm.
biopiracy, and
Mm.
supported by the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. The two great scandalous examples were of plant varieties collected from farmers' fields in North Africa, in Algeria, in Libya, in Tunisia, legume varieties, forage varieties,
Mm.
which were collected, and the write-up by CGI officials working out of that time Lebanon, by Icarta at that time. What they said is that we found these varieties, saw how important they would be for Australia, immediately went back to our headquarters and sent them off to Australia even before we recorded them in our gene banks, in our gene
Oh,
bank, knowing they'd be profitable for Australia. that was
wow.
in writing and that blatant language. And the Australians
Mm.
immediately took the varieties that they received and patented them. They didn't do anything else with them. They simply went right from the mail office to the patent office and patented them
Really?
directly.
That is crazy.
Yeah, that was true, and they were forced to finally drop them, and staff at FAO
Mm.
were fired, and the head of or staff, pardon me, of Carter were fired, and the director general sometime years later told me he lost $10 million in funding from major government bilateral agencies because of that, which I was quite pleased with actually. Um, but but it led to
Mm.
more than 100 plant patents like that in different countries had to be turned aside because we showed the biopiracies of that. Yeah.
Wow, excellent. That's a very good work.
Well, with
Looking
many
back,
partners, not just ourselves. I mean, we were
I know,
identified, but
yeah,
people were helping us find it.
but
And they
there's
were almost
always
always
leadership
farmers.
there, yeah. Somebody has to do the leadership anyway.
Well, we were
Looking
the first
back,
there, that's all.
yeah, looking back, how did corporations begin consolidating control over seeds, chemicals, and agricultural research? What were the key turning points?
Well, it's an old history in a way.
Mm-hmm.
The first, and you can say that big companies got interested in seeds several times over the last more than a century now. And they did so either because they thought they had a new technology that would give them monopoly control of seeds through that technology, or they thought they had a platform, a technique as opposed to a technology that they could utilize that gave them a key pivotal position in the marketplace that they
Mm-hmm.
could dominate. And the first case of where this happened was General Electric. The largest seed company in the world in the 1920s was General Electric.
Oh, electric into seed.
Yes. And the
Hmm.
reason was because they were developing radiation technologies, and they were using that for medicine and for nuclear power.
Mm-hmm.
And they realized that in doing that, developing that is, hey, when we radiate things, we knock all the genes all over the place, and we can get all kinds of strange combinations, and some of them are useful. Most of them aren't, but a
Mm-hmm.
few of them are useful. So they started to develop these sites where they would bombard seeds in large
Mm-hmm.
quantities of seeds with radiation, and then search through it all and see if there's anything there that they could find that they could develop. And
Mm-hmm.
they were very excited about that. Thought they bought some seed companies along the way to do that themselves, but they were sure that they had a patent control over their radiation technology, and that would give them the way to change the world. They gave up after a while because the rate of return on the bombardment was extremely low. And
Mm-hmm.
there still is now, FAO together with the International Atomic Energy Commission has in Vienna still a center for radiation research on plant varieties.
Mm-hmm.
And they do quite a bit of work, and some that's been better developed, but it's more now a public sector research activity, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
still quite dubious in many ways. But they
Mm-hmm.
claim that they're doing something. But anyway, General Electric moved in because of technology and then dropped out again. Then in the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, Standard Oil in New Jersey, now ExxonMobil, uh,
Mm-hmm.
thought they had the platform that would give them control over all agricultural inputs because they had the gas stations all over the world. And the gas stations were
Mhm.
where the farmers went to fill up their tractors or would
Mhm.
go to fill up their tractors. And while they were there, they might as well pick up fertilizers, they might as well pick up seeds and all the other
Mm.
inputs for agriculture. So Royal Dutch Shell, probably first Standard Oil, started to buy up seed companies and promote these sort of agricultural centers, which they again quickly found was not going to be profitable, and they dropped it. But for a
Mhm.
while, they were the dominant player. Then the third
Mhm.
time was in the 1960s and the 1970s when Royal Dutch Shell got into the game, seeing that,
Again.
yeah,
Mm.
their interest was again that they thought that the chemical developments that were going on, which they were heavily involved in with plastics and all those kinds of aspects of the fossil carbon industry, would get them more into fertilizers and more into coatings for seeds and the seeds themselves, and that they could control that market. So
Mm.
in the by the late 1960s, Royal Dutch Shell had bought more than 100 family seed companies,
Mhm.
and was by far the largest seed company in the world. Uh,
Mm.
and everyone was, all the worry was, and we went around saying that um, the prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," shouldn't be a prayer to Shell Oil, and which was quite effective actually. and, and and it really, and that was what we focused on. But Shell Oil was pushing very hard and very aggressively for plant
Mm.
plant breeders' rights legislation around the world to give them the
Mm.
patent monopoly they thought they needed. Well, again, Shell decided that it wasn't profitable for them, profitable enough, so they sold off their interest to what became ultimately down the road Monsanto. Monsanto
Mm.
got seeds from all kinds of companies from all kinds of places, but and the pharmaceutical companies had the same interest. The pharmaceutical companies said, "Well, all this chemical research we're doing is we're heavily into biology. We're doing a lot of our research, and it was what we call biopiracy, which was going around collecting local knowledge from farmers
Mhm.
and indigenous peoples to take that and turn it into new drugs. And they saw the same possibility with crop seed from farmers' fields, and again got into the business. And
Mhm.
uh, Monsanto, of course, was originally a chemical and a pharmaceutical company. In time, of course,
Mm.
it's evolved and evolved. And when we first started to look at it in the 1970s, there were, I think FAO had a book which listed 7,000 different seed companies around the world. Some of them
Wow.
were some of those were public companies. Most of them were private companies. And now we've got five or six at the most you can think are as commercially
Yeah.
important
Mm.
globally. And
Mm.
we warned about that back even in the 1980s.
So these companies have bought those 7,000 companies
Yeah.
or more, companies that are
Well, maybe
there.
some of the small companies are still there, but they're smaller than they were even before,
Mm.
and they have no influence in the marketplace at all.
Mm.
The
Mm.
dominance is those companies who did what they said they couldn't do, which was put together herbicide tolerant plant varieties with, and of course, we warned about it, but I have to be honest, I had no idea that it would be through biotechnology as such. I wasn't
Mm.
quite sure how it would be done. It was simply following the money, the logic, which I still would recommend as an important way for AFSA and your colleagues to
Mm.
to
Mm.
look at anything happening in agriculture, see where the money would tend to go. Uh, the technology will be dragged along, kicking and screaming sometimes, but dragged along to justify that,
Mm.
claiming that there's new
Mm.
technologies that will make it useful to do that. But the companies certainly saw that if they could somehow put seeds and pesticides together, they would control a very important market.
I mean, have they addressed any need when they were doing that? Any needs related to food security or any need
I think
by
some of them
doing that?
thought they were. The individual scientists certainly did. I remember talking to plant breeders with what was called Sivagagi again in those days,
Mm.
saying that, to me, I think an open wonderment that he knew his company was doing a lot of research on herbicide tolerance. The only marketable use he saw for it was against what he called Johnson's grass in Texas.
Mm.
That was the
Mhm.
only place you could imagine. He's speaking from Basel, Germany, or Switzerland, pardon me, and he could only see a possible use for it as a niche market in Texas. And
Hmm.
that was incredibly naive on his part. I'm sure he
Hmm.
didn't stay in the
Hmm.
company much longer.
Let's talk about the Green Revolution and the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa.
Yeah.
Um, what role have they, these companies have started to consolidate and they needed an actor
Yeah.
in the South and also an initiative. Uh, do you link the company's consolidation of the seed and chemical markets with the starting of the Green Revolution agenda and also the starting of Agra in Africa? And what is the role in shaping the food system in general?
I think there's a distinction between the starting of the Green Revolution, not just in time, and Agra, not
Mm,
as much as I wish there were, but there is a
mm,
difference a little bit. The Green Revolution began as very much a public sector initiative. I think
mm,
there were really no companies that were interested in it even. It was maybe the fertilizer companies or the oil companies might have seen that
mm,
so-called modernization wouldn't
mm,
be a bad thing, and that they could something if it worked, something might come out of that, or
mm,
more affluent agriculture in countries like India and Brazil and Argentina might give them more of
mm,
a market in the future. But that was really it.
mm,
It was really Western colonial interests that dominated that,
mm,
and it's the way to feed the world. And I mean, there was a problem after World War II, no question about it. And there was a
mm,
concern about what could be done. But the concern was mostly, you look at the origin of foreign aid programs, Canada's foreign aid program, for example, it
mm,
came in the 1950s, it came out of a fear of the red revolution around the world, coming out of China and infecting, as they would put it, Asia,
mm,
and the need to address that problem. And
mm,
improving food production, they thought, was a fast way to counter the Chinese.
mm,
Canada's prime minister at the time, who was one of our better prime ministers, which doesn't sound good when you understand what he did, was that to say that he went to set up Canada's foreign aid program because there were a dollar shortage in a sterling area, and they had, which
mm,
was
mm,
South Asia, and
mm,
food introduction of food supports and so on was a way to solve several problems at the same time.
mm, mm.
Among which was the idea that maybe they could solve some hunger along the way. But
Yeah,
there
okay,
were,
thank you very much. So what is the role of the Green Revolution in
it's been
general
extremely
in
important.
shaping the
It,
food system?
Absolutely, it became very important. Uh, I think, again, not because it was a strategy, but because if you follow the logic and follow the money, it went
Mm-hmm,
where it would go. The companies saw the Green Revolution, proved to them fundamentally that technology of being able to develop a trait which could be universalized. Everyone could use it, semi-dwarf varieties, uh, could increase yield very quickly with all kinds of other consequences, but which they didn't
mm,
particularly care about or think about. But it could do that. And the Green Revolution proved that could be done with wheat, rice, and maize, three huge crops. So there could be a
mm,
global marketplace. Secondly, they had the tool, the utility of
mm,
these what became 15 international agricultural research centers scattered around the
mm,
globe, which were big scientific institutions that dominated virtually every country except for perhaps China and India and Brazil. Um, but even there, they dominated heavily still in India. That could um, facilitate the movement of new technologies and new technological strategies, and could also, as sort of semi-United Nations institutions, could be a training center for national scientists to adopt
mm,
new technologies, and could be emissaries on behalf of the companies, not
mm,
knowingly always, but sometimes knowingly, to promote new technological strategies, new northern
mm,
technological
mm,
strategies, Western technological strategies that
mm,
the companies could follow up on. So they became an easy sort of conduit
Mm-hmm.
and an avenue of travel and representation for the companies to be able to influence public agricultural research stations and ministries in the global south. I think at
Mm-hmm.
one point in the 90s, it was estimated, 1990s, it was estimated that something like two-thirds of agriculture ministers had a connection to CGIR centers somewhere in the world, or had
Wow.
gone to
Wow.
one of their training programs at some time in their career, were
Mm-hmm.
heavily influenced by them, were serving on boards and so on of those
Mm-hmm.
institutions. And
Mm-hmm.
virtually every scientist, agronomist in the global south um, seemed to somehow be brought to training at one of the universities where they were exposed to public sector and private sector uh, organizations, talking to them about how the future of agriculture would be in a certain way. So it really was an important tool. They could literally ride under the flag of the United Nations, or what seemed to be that kind of a
Mm-hmm.
flag, which the CG centers had, to be able to promote their view of agriculture and the way of working in the world, subsidized by public monies, foreign aid money.
So will I be right if I say that, well, the Green Revolution was a public agenda, and
Very much. It ignored
probably it
Africa,
was,
for example. It just
yeah,
Africa wasn't relevant. It was absolutely set aside in the Green
yeah,
Revolution.
yeah. So the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa was created to replicate the experience of Asia into Africa, Asia and Mexico into Africa.
Yeah.
But can we say that, yeah, well, when it was created for public good, let's say. And some
I
organizations like Rockefeller, whatever, played a big role. But later on, it was, through all these 15 research centers all over the world, it was used again by the companies to promote their agenda. Would I be right if I put it like
in
that?
broad strokes, you're right, but it was
Hmm.
a little more nuanced to it, if I can.
Okay, okay, please, yes.
I think that the likes of Bill Gates and so on were uh, were colonialist and northern and racist and everything else,
Mm,
but not necessarily so much capitalist. Although certainly his background saw the solutions were probably through a capitalist system,
mm,
but it was kind of a genuine feeling that he was going to feed the hungry and
mhm,
solve a problem that couldn't be solved otherwise. And Gates
mhm,
wasn't interested in the CGIR, not at all.
mhm,
He had a friend of his, um, 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 I'm trying to think of his name now. He's slipped out of my mind. Um, that had owned two different agricultural
mhm,
biotech private companies that he'd sold off and become a very wealthy person by himself. Um, and it was named, but will come back to me. And who was
mhm,
a very nice man, actually. I didn't agree with
mhm,
his approach to the technologies. I didn't think any of that was good, but his heart was kind of in the right place. And he convinced Bill Gates that he really should get involved in agriculture, but they
mhm,
should kind of ignore the CG centers because they weren't doing a good job. He was right about that.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and that was one area that he and I both agreed upon over the years. Uh,
mhm,
and the Sam Dryden was his name, and
uh-huh, mm,
he's died, I think now, but Sam
mhm,
had been conned into being the chair of the private sector committee of the CGIR in the
mhm,
late 90s, early 2000s, and I got to know him fairly well during that time.
mhm,
As I was the guy shouting against them, not the only one. Again, many of us were, and Sam was on the other side. But funny enough, Sam would always kind of agree with us. Anything we said bad about
mhm,
the CG, he kind of agreed with. Um,
mhm, mhm,
but so the initial involvement in Agra was really not to involve the CGIR. It was to find another way to do things that didn't have to waste money on what they saw as a highly bureaucratic, administratively
mhm,
incompetent body of the CG system. And Gary Tennyson was one of the other key people involved in this from the Rockefeller Foundation. And
mhm,
Rockefeller Foundation had just, and Gary was a very strong advocate of the Green Revolution. And Rockefeller Foundation had just changed presidency, and the woman who moved in as president had no interest in agriculture whatsoever. decided to scrap the whole agricultural department of Rockefeller.
Mm-hmm.
And I visited Gary because it's strange how over the decades, you've been around long enough, your enemies become your friends as well. At a certain level,
Yeah.
you've been in so many battles across the table from each other that
Mm.
kind of you kind of have a certain respect at least. Um, it doesn't
Mm.
change your politics, but at least it shouldn't change your
Yeah,
politics.
somehow, yeah.
But and I went to go and have lunch with Gary, and I was amazed at the fifth floor offices over Fifth Avenue, pardon me, over of the Rockefeller Center Foundation,
Mm.
pardon me, were empty. And
Mm.
I walked, and I'd arranged to have lunch with Gary, and finally they put me up on the right floor, and they sent me into this empty full of empty desks and tables and so on, and finally found Gary in the corner with his secretary, and
Mm.
he was apologized and got up and said, "Yeah, we were just closing down, and now we're starting up again." And I said, we went to lunch
Mm.
and I said, so what happened? And he said,
Mhm.
well, Gates called my president and said,
Mhm.
how about starting a green revolution for Africa? And he had piles of
Mhm.
money to put into it. And suddenly Rockefeller Foundation said, oh, we'll put money into it as well. and suddenly they were up and running again. And
Interesting, yeah. Mm.
but it was quite an amazing moment. Gary
Yeah.
was quitting. He was resigning. He was fed up. But he decided
Mm.
he'd leave it to others. But he felt that there should be support for the CG centers, and no one else was interested. In the end, of course, um, uh, um, Sam Dryden realized that he needed to use the CG centers as a cheap tool, cheap labor for the work they wanted to
Mhm.
get done. What they
Mhm.
needed to do was to transform the CGIR into a much more useful tool for themselves.
Mhm.
It was too much of a public sector body to be useful as it was. And
Mhm.
they turned it around. And all the
Mm.
bad things you want to say about agri, I'm very much happy to agree with. And, and against the Green Revolution as well.
But the one CJR agenda is Gates' agenda, no?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Gate,
So
but yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But the
we
Green Revolution wasn't Gates' agenda, but it was, he
no,
didn't know
no,
anything
yeah,
about it.
yeah. Started a long time ago,
Yeah,
before
yeah,
him. Yeah. Okay, let's take about intellectual property rights, So you've long wondered about the dangers of seed patents and intellectual property rights.
yeah, yeah.
What's at stake for farmers when seeds are privatized?
Well, it's this is going to sound slightly strange. It's because I've also changed my views a bit. I haven't changed my
Oh,
views about
really?
patent. I haven't changed my views about patenting,
Uh,
but at all. They're horrible.
mm,
Any kind of intellectual monopoly is just plain dumb, stupid,
mm,
the
mm,
opposite of
mm,
intellectual. It doesn't do anything for society. It causes damage and it creates monopolies, of course.
mm,
But the the role of patents, I think, was different uh, in certainly up to the 1960s than it was afterwards, and it changed again by the 1980s or 90s, at least by the 1990s,
mm,
certainly. Um, it it is a regulatory system which um, governments are responsible for, and that makes it cheaper for companies. It lets
mhm,
companies do a lot more cheaply because of patents, but it is a tool, one of the tools that companies use, and especially in the terms of biology, because there's all kinds of
mm,
biological weapons that can be applied, biological
mm,
technologies that can be used outside of the patent system that are as effective
mm,
or more effective. And there's also uh, not just biologies that can be changed, but of course the whole concept of
mm,
contract law, which is long before patent law, by the
mm,
licenses and so on that are signed and so on, that change. It's a change. What the patent law did, what plant breeders' rights did initially, was change the entire uh, entrepreneurial or commercial environment uh,
mhm,
in scientific environment to say, oh, this is really important. This is the tool we need to use. This is the one we know about, and and change government's thoughts. Okay, we can sit back and relax now. We can let the companies do their job because they're now going to be inspired by the patent opportunities to do the work for us. And the companies use the patent concept to say to governments and to public research institutions, look, you guys, you can't compete with us. We've got the muscle, we've got the incentive now of patent
Yeah.
regulation to do the job. So we'll tell you what to do, and your
Mm,
bosses and your political bosses listen to us more than they listen to you, and they believe that this is a way for them to reduce their expenses in public research, and let us do work the wonders of the unseen hand writing on the wall
mm,
of commerce. And so it created that environment. It
mm,
and from that they've built all of the biological tools. Began with hybrids, and that was before the intellectual property issues became important. But it shows
mm,
the power of the technology itself. And from that, and then of course it went on to all of the biotechnology tools that we know of now, genetically modifying
mm,
crops,
mm.
CRISPR-Cas9, and the whole wonderful gamut
Yeah,
of
yeah,
exciting new tools.
yeah. Which we are going to explore
Later.
on our second
Yeah,
interview. Yeah,
yeah.
but it's fascinating. But so what you said you've changed your mind on that.
Well, no, I think patents are
What's the
terrible. They should be
change?
fought. They should be absolutely fought because they are the easy first step down the road to uh, incentivizing the companies to impose regulatory
Yeah,
rules of
yeah, obviously, yeah,
all kinds of other tools on governments,
yeah,
and to constrain the public sector researchers to make them
yeah,
simply again the
yeah,
cheap labor
yeah,
of the
yeah.
company. So they
So
should
so
absolutely be opposed.
how does treaties and agreements reinforce the corporate agenda?
Well, they all can for sure, and they certainly in terms of UPOV, they
Yeah.
do
Mm,
that. It's shocking if you look at what's happened with uh, plant varieties, for example. We went
yeah.
back and looked. I don't know if you want to segue into this. I can shut up. Um,
No.
in 1930, the first really major patent law for plants was the U.S. Plant Patent Act of 1930. And
Mm,
in introducing that patent law, the company said, this is going to allow us to, let me be clear about this, one, um, introduce new species for plant breeding,
mm-hmm,
which we wouldn't put money into otherwise. We can bring new species into breeding that we wouldn't touch. Secondly, it'll produce lots of new varieties of new plants. And thirdly, it'll bring in lots of new plant breeders because we'll have
mm-hmm,
the commercial interest to do that. So the intellectual contribution will be huge because of that. So that was in 1930, and there was a big boom in the first few years of the U.S. patent law of new species, new varieties of all kinds coming into the marketplace. Um, if you look back on the law, there were studies done of it by lawyers in the 1940s. Again, in the 1980s, we used our little computer that no one else had
mm-hmm, mm,
to analyze it in the late 1980s. What had
mm,
happened was in 1930, all that happened was that all of the varieties that had been found in
mm-hmm,
farmers' fields and so on, like thornless roses, for example, were found by two kids in a field in Texas, and they suddenly became patentable in 1930. So all kinds of things that were out there that were novel and interesting all jumped onto the patent list and were patented.
mm, mm,
Um, but if you went just a few years after that, uh, the Patent Act produced roses and chrysanthemums and
mm,
African violets and a few apples, and that's just about it.
mm,
Everything piled onto a handful of species. And we saw the number of companies shrinking. We saw the number of species shrinking in terms of actual patenting, and we saw
mm,
the number of varieties shrinking. There's a
mm,
sort of a flourishing of brand names,
mm,
but like Model T cars, when you have a new brand a new model of it every year, but really the same old car. And this is what the varieties
yeah.
were. So it created no diversity at all. It was so patently obvious
Yeah.
that was what happened. And the same things were said, of course, back when my old Minister of Agriculture in Canada was saying we need to have this legislation for a more beautiful Canada and to feed the world. None of that has happened. We've seen a major
No, yeah.
focus.
Hmm.
on the traditional crops, the biggest
Hmm.
crops in the world, and all of them using basically the same varieties. I mean,
Yeah,
every
yeah,
every every maize variety, hybrid variety of maize, which are all in the system, use the same inbred lines, basically.
yeah. No, finally, I think this is our part one, our conversation. We're going to continue discussion into other forms of company appropriation of, the property of farmers from the south and also somehow from the north to some extent. And the fewer companies controlling almost everything in the world,
Yeah,
they're becoming
yeah.
fewer and fewer. But finally, what do you see in the future? How is it going, this consolidation of power and the food system and whatever,
Well,
Where
it's
is it going? Yeah. Yeah.
well, it's using the same tools it has, I think, for the whole of the last century. For the same reasons that a General Electric at one time and maybe the counterpart to
Mm,
General Electric today is Microsoft or it's Apple or it's
mm-hmm,
Amazon or it's Google. But they think they have the technological thing, control of data, which and AI, which is going to give them the monopoly for the future. And they may or they
mm,
may not be right, but I think that the door is still the jury is still out. We're not sure where that's going to
mm,
go. It's extraordinarily dangerous, but it's there. But they can be wrong. It could
mm,
also be like the more like the Royal Dutch Shell or the Standard Oil New Jersey's approach, which is that it could be a company, again, Amazon perhaps more fits into that category of
mm,
we can add on food the same way we add on toilet paper and to what we sell around the world. We can do this. We
yeah,
have the system, we have the platform that is
mm,
everywhere already. We already can do the distribution, and we can take it on from there. Or it could be
mm,
those threats are still there. If we think, I remember that when the merger took place between where Dow and DuPont merged and Bayer and Monsanto and so on. And a lot of our colleagues were saying, and I think quite wrongly at the time, because we were arguing that we should fight those mergers. And I think we could have fought them and we could have won, and we failed to do it. But the concern that we had was what people were saying was, who cares if it's six companies or four companies or three? It's irrelevant. There's just a few companies. And I was saying, and several others of our colleagues were saying, no, no, no. If they're allowed to do this, then the next kind of a merger system we're going to see is going to be much bigger and much more powerful. And we were talking already then about digital technologies and how dangerous they could be.
mm, mm,
And
mm,
I think we weren't seeing in civil society where the trend lines were going. And again, now I still don't think we see the scope of the trend lines that we're faced with. So I
mm.
think that we think we need to be aware of where the history has been, why things didn't work and why things did work, uh, and in the marketplace and in civil society, and plan for that for the future.
Thank you so much, Pat. Thanks a lot. I think we'll arrange for the next time and come back again and talk about some more things. It's so much, we haven't even scratched the surface yet. All those your stories. Thank you.
Well, I can ramble on forever. Thanks.
Okay. No, it was really fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay, a million. Take care.